During the 70 years leading up to the 1978 Soviet-backed communist coup, I was in Moscow at the time as the first secretary of the American Embassy, and we followed that. There was a rudimentary pluralistic constitutional democracy, an increasingly inclusive civil society, and a free enterprise economy that were slowly, unevenly, but undeniably developing in Afghanistan. This process occurred alongside the national lawyer jirga and local shura traditions of bringing the country's diverse ethnic and religious groups together to consult and reach decisions. We all know that. Unfortunately, for Afghanistan, the Constitution created and implemented in 2001 at Bonn, as the ambassador mentioned, established centralized, compact, pyramidal concentration of power that guaranteed a failing government, very corrupt centralized governance. One positive decentralizing part of the Constitution, there weren't many, came in the form of elections for district councils around the country to decentralize power, like Niamut had mentioned. But that provision was ignored by both the Karzai and the Ghani administration. To make matters worse, the Soviet Union and Pakistan's invasions of Afghanistan, I would call that invasions for Pakistan as well, because if you look in Webster's dictionary, one country crosses the international border of another country and attacks it, that's the definition of invasion. That interceded at a very critical developmental time for Afghanistan. And it introduced a totalitarian doctrine, you could say ideology, into Afghanistan, which had nothing to do with Afghan culture and traditions. The 1979 Soviet invasion and then the communist efforts to impose the communist political system on Afghanistan, of course, failed miserably, but so did the following, and in some ways simultaneously, from the Soviet occupation, because in some ways it was a reaction to the Soviet occupation. The Muslim Brotherhood combined with the Saudi Salafist approach, where religion comes from the mosque, and also political power comes from the mosque, was very much infused with the jihadist invasion of Afghanistan that was initiated by Pakistan's dictator Zia-ul-Haq and his ISI, the Pakistani military intelligence. They also enabled both of these invasions of Afghanistan, previously fringe elements of Afghan society. ISI, for its part, sponsored the most anti-traditionalist, brutal extremists, first Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and later the Taliban. Before, before the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Mujahideen resistance the first time around, the United States was very key in providing essential military and economic assistance to the Mujahideen. It had to go through Zia-ul-Haq's Pakistan, and we had no choice. We could have gone through Iran, we could have gone through China, we could have gone through the Soviet Union to deliver our aid to the Mujahideen. But we had to go through Zia-ul-Haq, who himself was promoting his jihadist invasion of Afghanistan. The 2001 conversation that I had with Masood in Dushanbe 2 months before his assassination, he estimated at that time 25,000 Pakistani troops, 2 Al-Qaeda brigades of Arabs, and of course, a horde of Taliban combined every year to attack his front lines. This led to a very disastrous and dangerous situation, and Massoud had to pull back to Dushanbe to receive assistance from India, Iran, and the Soviet Union. During that conversation, he summed up that the Soviets had invaded from the north previously. Now the Pakistanis are invading from the south. That reminded me of a mournful joke. A former Afghan general, General Rahmatullah Safi, cracked during one of our meetings in Peshawar in 1991. First, we were invaded by our enemies, then we were invaded by our friends. In our Dushanbe meeting, Massoud observed that Pakistan lacks the necessary internal cohesion long term. It lacks the military and economic capabilities to hold on to Afghanistan long term. I personally believe he was right, and I think earlier speakers did too, in stating that someday the sun will rise again over the Hindu Kush Mountains, and Afghanistan will enjoy a different phase in its history. When I was Special Envoy, I never missed an opportunity to badger Pakistani generals to resume weapons and ammunition supplies to Massoud. As the Soviets were pulling out in 1988 and 1999, the Pakistani ISI pivoted into Afghanistan on the heels of the Soviet withdrawal. And they ceased weapon supplies to the moderate commanders like Ahmad Shah Massoud, Ismail Khan, and others near the Pakistani border. The reason they did that was they saw that the biggest danger to their imposition of Hekmatyar on the Kabul throne came from those moderate commanders. I spent much time in ISI offices and also in Washington and various government offices, insisting that Massoud receive his fair share of weapons. He had received them while the Soviets were there because he was able to cause Soviet casualties. When the Soviets left, he was no longer useful to the ISI. So I did make some progress. I ensured also that Massoud Shuri Nazar was receiving economic aid, also humanitarian aid for the system of hospitals he ran and health clinics in the north, also assistance for agriculture and humanitarian assistance. Slide, please. Oh, incidentally, before you go, I want to point out there is somebody in this very room who is in this photo, and that's Wali Massoud at that time. And that is Ahmed Zia, Wali's brother. And when I met, I also met Yahya Massoud, the oldest brother. When I met Ahmed Shah Massoud this time in Kabul and later in Dushanbe, I was able to crack a joke. And he's laughing from that joke, which I said, I'm pleased to meet you because you're the only Massoud brother I have not met. Actually, at this point, we're sending economic and military aid up to Garam Chesma. Garam Chesma, as Wali will remember, was the Massoud warehouse for ammunition, weapons, also humanitarian aid. John Mohammed is in back of Ahmed Zia, and he managed that warehouse. And when I visited Panjshir a couple of times after 2001, I had a very happy reunion with John Mohammed. But my first trip there to that warehouse, there were no weapons. There was no food, nothing in the warehouse. And I went back to Washington and complained. I complained in Islamabad, and pretty soon trucks began to go up the Karakoram Mountain Road to Garam Chestnut and loading up the warehouse. Could you do the next slide? And the next slide will show you Masood's method of transportation of our assistance to him in the Panjshir, which incidentally was only about 90 miles away from this point in just below Badakhshan. Here you have a donkey on top who was carrying two 4 107 rocket rounds to Masood, and another donkey there getting ready, getting loaded up, and they're carrying, that donkey's carrying ammunition. So during this period with AID funding, we built a road from Garam Cheshma up across the Pakistan-Afghan border and over to Zibak near Eshkasham on the Amu Darya. And Masood then was able to switch from donkeys to vehicles and take weapons that he bought and food and other essentials in the Pakistani markets on that road all the way up to his bases in the Panjshir. I mean, they couldn't go by vehicle all the way, but most of the way. So during my time as Special Envoy on Afghanistan, I, of course, was a diplomat. I was not an aid worker or a journalist. And I was able to help Masood in diplomatic areas. I arranged for a delegation to be sent from Masood to the director of Saudi intelligence, Turki Al Faisal in Riyadh. I believe Ahmed Zia led that delegation. I also arranged for a delegation to go from Masood to Rome to meet former King Zahir Shah, because at that time the UN peace program was developing, and Masood was isolated in the Panjshir. This gave him an opportunity to begin involvement with the peace process and to pass on his positions in the process so that they would be taken into consideration. Now, time doesn't permit me to go anywhere else but two instances where Masood benefited from in facing the unremitting focus of Pakistani and Taliban pressure against him. Earlier, also pressure from the Najib government. The first was the Afghan-only National Commanders Shura, which was created in 1990. Many supporters of Masood in the Mujahideen in the West, in Britain and Washington, we were very worried that after the Soviets pulled out, because the moderates had ceased receiving weaponry from ISI, that there were no victories. A whole year and a half passed where the Mujahideen, after the Soviet pullout, made no military progress in Afghanistan. And we were in danger of losing funding in Congress. Also in the public opinion, we were slipping. Why are we still there? What's going on? So in Washington, a number of us developed this idea of a national commander shura, which fit well into Ahmad Shah Massoud's overall approach of bringing Afghan commanders together. ISI separated with its money and its weapons transfers to Mujahideen commanders, separated Mujahideen commanders. This idea fit well with Massoud's approach, where he was very successful in bringing commanders together under his banner in the north. So we sort of transposed that to the whole country. So I took this proposal to ISI after the US government approved it. ISI reluctantly approved it, but they kept the poison pill commanders inside the commander Shura, commanders that would report back to them. And if they ever turned against the Shura, then they could pull the plug and it would collapse. The majority, the great majority, enthusiastic majority of the commanders in the National Commander Shura were moderates, both in all ethnicities that participated were moderates. The extremists stayed away. Hek Machar denounced the National Commander Shura, and that helped us a lot. So as that Shura developed, it gained steam. It had two rules. One is that all Shura meetings had to be held inside of Afghanistan. They couldn't be held in Pakistan. Second rule was that when the commanders gathered, they had a meeting area like this, where Afghans, as Sandy says in his book, From Birth, they are learning to sit on the ground. We Westerners have a hard time with that. Then it's a very equal process, very diverse process, great representation. So it was the first genuine all-Afghan national institution to appear since the 1973 Afghan communist coup. The US, Pakistan, and Prince Turkey also, ISI reluctantly donated money to the National Commander Shura. The first two Shuras met above Peshawar inside Afghanistan. The second one drew 300 commanders. After that successful second Shura, 1,000 commanders attempted to join the Shura. Most of them, of course, moderates. The third Commander Shura was convened in Shah Salim. You see here, Masood is the convener of that meeting. Jalaluddin Haqqani, one of the poison pills of ISI and the Shura, he's seated next to Masood. Some Shia commanders, very anti-Taliban, of course, are sitting on the right. The great commander Abdul Haq, the Pashtun commander, who was wounded 17 times, probably the most famous Pashtun commander from the Jalalabad area. He's at the far left. So because he was the largest commander in the north, this Shura was hosted this time by a commander from the north. Masood trekked down from the frontier. He's a very strong supporter of the Shura. Ismail Khan sent his senior deputy to the Shura. It was a great success. The Shura reflected actually Masood's approach, whereby there are almost simultaneous attacks on the communist regime that the Soviets left behind, led by Najibullah. It would attack communist positions in all regions of Afghanistan at basically the same time. It was an out-in strategy. And after those attacks, then commanders would close in on Kabul and Kabul would collapse. And that basically worked because the 1991 security strategy that Masood, I think he was the brains behind it and they approved it, went into effect in early 1991. First, Khost fell in March. Zaranj in far western Afghanistan fell in May. And Masood, when the snows melted in the north, he captured 8 bases in the north, pretty much swept all of the north and created 300 borders of his command with the Soviet Union at that time. And the Soviets asked for border negotiations with Masood because he and not the communist regime headed by Najibullah in Kabul was the power in the north. And Masood agreed But he said to the Soviets, you have one outpost across the Amu Darya in Afghanistan near Eshkasham, and you have to take that outpost back to the Soviet Union, and then I will negotiate with you. And they abandoned the outpost and took it back. So this was a very successful initiative, and I think it helped pave the way to what happened in '92. That is, Massoud got to Kabul first before Hekmatyar in April, and please read Sandy Gall's excellent book for a lively account, firsthand account on the ground account of that story. So my last meeting was with Massoud, took place at his rear headquarters in Dushanbe as I mentioned, 2001, 2 months before he was tragically assassinated. Abdul Haq accompanied me. In fact, he asked me to make this trip, Abdul Haq did, because he wanted to meet Massoud. Others were getting in touch with Massoud, like Hamid Karzai had visited Massoud. He had a set of commanders in the south. Massoud by that time had expanded his control quite significantly, and he was in radio contact with Ismail Khan and other Tajik, Hazara, Turkmen commanders in the north, and he'd known them all, of course, from the Commander Shura process. And he also was in radio contact with members of his overall network, including Abdul Haq's brother, Haji Qadir, who was operating in Nuristan. So he was on the move, and he told us at that meeting he was sure that the Taliban would eventually be defeated. He would defeat them up in the north, but others too would weaken them and help produce the final victory. Massoud's ideas propounded at our meeting in early 2001 might today be of value to Ahmad Shah's son and his followers in the embattled Panjshir Valley. Then as now, father and son were contending with unrelenting Pakistani and Taliban military pressure. The father in Dushanbe looked beyond the Taliban defeat with a view to prepare for the post-war period, something that Ahmad Shah now in the Panjshir Valley could and should be looking at, like his father did before the defeat of the Taliban. This entailed avoiding the mistakes of the Mujahideen in Kabul 1992 to 1996 that damaged Afghan solidarity and helped the Taliban, described in Sandy Gall's book. During the Dushanbe discussions, Massoud voluntarily acknowledged mistakes he had made when he served as defense minister. He said they should not be repeated. He also went on to say that in terms of military shuras, no military shura commander should be allowed to create his own separate fiefdom, like Dostam did, like some of the Shia commanders did in Kabul. And it created a civil war type setting rather than a united Mujahideen government. Also, he said no military commander should be permitted to maintain foreigners, especially Arab extremists and drug smugglers, among the followers. He declared that there should be a written commitment after the Taliban were defeated for the sake of peace, stating that he personally would not take a position for himself in the post-Taliban government. On the interim government, he accepted, of course, Zahir Shah is no longer around, but he accepted in our conversations that Zahir Shah is the head of the next interim government. I think Zalmay Rasul was in Rome at that time. The timing was right. It was time to hold a Loya Jirga, even if it had to be held outside the country. bring as many representative Afghans together as possible, hold the Loya Jirga, and create an interim government. And the interim government should be broad-based. Masood told us he was worried that Zahir Shah and his advisors in Rome were being approached by the Taliban to negotiate bilaterally agreements. And Masood told us, pass on to Zahir Shah, don't do that. We should first form an interim government that's broad-based and then negotiate with the Taliban. He also thought that the interim government had to be located inside Afghanistan. We said, what if the liberated area is not large enough? And he said, well, if you have to do it outside, okay, but he said it won't be effective. It must be inside. When Abdul Haq raised the possibility, why don't we recreate the National Commander Shura that we had before that was successful? He said, I already have my United Front, which is also combining different ethnicities, different regions. But regardless of which way you go, a new United Front or recreate the National Commander Shura, that all commanders, he repeated, should be inside Afghanistan. He mentioned that Hamid Karzai in his visit had wanted to get Masood involved with his commanders, and Masood responded that really you should not have your headquarters in Quetta, Pakistan, for your commanders to come into Pakistan and get their instructions and assistance. I can help you set up in Gore province. I will provide you weapons and equipment, but by all means, you have to cease trying to operate out of Pakistan, which is the enemy. So the Panjshir National Resistance Movement, led by Ahmad Shah Massoud, holds is in a very precarious position right now. There are similarities with Massoud's time that are apparent, like for instance, some of his commanders like Amrullah Saleh, incidentally, in Dushanbe, a young Amrullah Saleh was the interpreter. Amrullah Saleh and also Bismillah Khan, they have bridged both Massoud's battles against the Taliban and now Ahmad Shah's battles against the Taliban from northern Afghanistan and the Panjshir. Let me conclude here that if Commander Massoud were with us here today, he would deeply approve of his son's National Resistance Front's brave defiance against the Taliban, just as he did against the Soviets and later the Taliban totalitarianism. And he would be proud that his son, the thousands of brave fighters with him in the Panjshir Valley, like all of us in this room, are celebrating his noble legacy in support of Afghan freedom. Thank you.